And welcome in, Draft Nicks, to Draft Nation. This episode, there's the old Beatles song, The Long and Winding Road. The long and winding road is certainly an interesting way that could be used to describe what is happening with the Pittsburgh Penguins. We'll get into it in just a moment with Kelsey Surmacz of the Hockey News, who covers the Penguins on a daily basis and probably deserves hazard pay at this point for doing so. Don't forget draftnation.com, the place to go. You want to stay up to date on all the latest of what's going on with your favorite teams. That's the spot to be. Go create your free account today, and especially if you're a Penguins fan, it will involve a draft lottery. Could involve the first overall pick in the draft next summer, Who knows? Because they are not playing well, and that is an understatement. Just 4 regulation wins. Only one team in the league has fewer. Just 2 points clear of the bottom spot in the Eastern Conference standings, and dead last in the Metro Division after a 6-1 loss to the Utah Hockey Club at home on Sunday. Another rough weekend for the Pens. The one silver lining in the cloud was Sidney Crosby's 600th goal coming on home ice, but even that didn't really do much to put a dent in the feelings of dread and foreboding, Kelsey, that exist, I think, for a lot of Pens fans. It's, a lot of people expected it would be rough this year, perhaps a third straight year of missing the playoffs. But I don't think anybody expected the wheels would fall off this quickly and to this extent, that they would be at this point before Thanksgiving looking like a team that's lost and really has very little idea of how to find their way out of the woods.
Absolutely. I don't think anybody expected it to be spiraling this quickly, as you said. And I think the crazy thing, when you look at even just the offseason moves and their deficiencies last season, that we knew this wasn't a good defensive team coming into the season. Mm-hmm. They've had defensive issues for a couple years now. I think they're very systemic, but they kind of fixed the power play to some extent. They addressed the bottom 6, kind of improved the bottom 6. They improved some areas of weakness that, maybe could have made them even, you could argue, a touch better. They obviously never replaced Jake Gensel, which is a pretty big thing. And then that's coming into the picture now. But it's really hard to fathom how hard they have fallen off even from last season at this point.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of what you mentioned there has to do with roster construction, right? And there's a very good reason to believe that Kyle Dubas has not done a good enough job in addressing the depth positions on this roster. But I have a hard time necessarily putting 100% of the blame on the GM and the personnel decisions. And I know a lot of fans feel this way when it doesn't feel like the pieces that they do have are being utilized correctly. And I know Mike Sullivan will bristle at the idea that he's not making enough adjustments or making them quickly enough, because in his defense, he has made more adjustments this year than maybe his entire career behind the bench combined before this season. But there's still not the right kind of adjustments, at least in my opinion. I saw you had a piece of the Hockey News over the weekend, for example, that talked about the declining ice time or waning ice time or lack of ice time for some of these younger players, in particular the ones that are actually producing.
Yeah. And you look at some of the names on this list, and also what I found interesting is this isn't unexpected by any means, just if you look at this roster, but 8 of the top 10 guys in ice time are over the age of 30. And 8 of the top bottom guys in ice time are under the age of 30. So I think what we're seeing here is, the Penguins have a history of kind of sticking to their guns with their veterans, which is understandable. Their veterans are their best players, but you look at guys like Jesse Puljujärvi, who I think has played well enough to earn some elevation in ice time. You look at even Owen Pickering, he only saw 12 minutes and 9 seconds of ice time the other day, whereas his defense partner against Utah, Chris Letang, who's on the top pairing, saw 23 minutes, which again isn't unexpected. But you look at some of these guys that are playing their way into lineup spots, and it seems like their ice time is declining these past few games. So I just find that interesting. And I think something that goes into that too, obviously guys that aren't playing on special teams, guys that are in bottom six roles are naturally going to get less ice time, but the fourth line is getting more ice time than the third line right now. You see the third line has Drew O'Connor, Jesse Puljujarvi, Sam Poulin on it. I think Drew O'Connor's largely struggled this year, but those other two probably deserve a little bit more of a look than they're getting. And if they're going to be losing anyway, you might as well give these young guys an extended look.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that ice time, because if you break it out even strength wise, what you're seeing is even strength. He is rotating in, for example, the Puljujarvi Poulin O'Connor line in, right, at even strength. He's giving them their 5-on-5 opportunities, which is good. That's what we want to see, to be honest, for development reasonings. But it's hard to see that and then know that, okay, when special teams comes around, we're going to have the same old crew out there. And we've actually seen the power play. You mentioned the power play had found a little bit of life, or at least, had the right personnel perhaps in place at times earlier this year. It's when he took Letang and or Carlson off the top power play, right? And so I appreciate what he's doing in finally coming around to playing some of those youngsters or guys that they don't know as much about at even strength. But let's utilize some of that on special teams. That is the part where I think you can still hammer Mike Sullivan a good bit, which is, and you made this point, he is so uncomfortable going to those guys, the younger guys, in big spots, in big moments where you can either, put your finger in the dam, so to speak, and stop the other team from taking control of the game, or maybe take advantage of an opportunity on special teams to take control of the game yourself.
Yeah, and I even look at, so the penalty kill surrendered 3 goals against Utah, and Mike Sullivan pointed to them as basically the primary reason that they dropped that game was, Sid scored the power play goal, and then a few minutes later, Utah gets a power play and scores on it. Absolutely sucks all the momentum the Penguins had going. So I think of, even Kevin Hayes returned to the lineup. They sent Vasily Ponomarev back to Wilkes-Barre Scranton. Ponomarev's a good penalty killer.
Yeah.
And even just little adjustments like that. I liked Matt Nieto the first couple games he was in the lineup. Haven't been overly impressed with him in the last couple. So, I don't think there's any hurt in rotating these younger guys into the PK units, especially because even at the beginning of the season, Mike Sullivan kept stressing that for guys like Rucker McGroarty, for any young players that are coming up through the AHL, he said there's rarely a path for these younger players to come in and just play top 6 minutes. So I don't necessarily agree with that in all situations, but that's just the system. That's the way that the Penguins introduce younger players to NHL minutes. And he was putting McGroarty on the penalty kill. So if that's going to be the situation with these younger players that are coming up and trying to make their way into the lineup and see NHL minutes, put them in those penalty kill situations, give them those special team minutes. Give them an opportunity to, expand their versatility, and don't be so gung-ho about sticking to these veteran guys that evidently aren't doing much to keep you from the bottom of the standings.
Right.
And just as a note too, the Penguins are third from the bottom in the league in points percentage right now. The only 2 teams worse than them are Chicago and San Jose. So if that's, I don't really know what else to say about that, but that's where they are right now. So playing these younger guys in some of those situations probably wouldn't hurt them.
Well, and that's, I think, the thing is that, I understand that in past years, the system that Mike Sullivan had in place, like you point out, would involve getting younger guys involved on the depth lines and then working their way up the ladder, so to speak. But when you're at this point, when you're down there with the San Jose's and Chicago's of the world, when you're last in your division, when you're losing to Utah, who granted a lot of people felt good about coming into the year, and they have young talent. But when you're losing to Utah at home 6-1, like that, those are the kind of moments where you go, okay, it's time to reevaluate how we do things. And I guess that's where the conversation kind of flows from here, which is, how is Kyle Dubas reevaluating how things are done? Because, the buck is going to stop with Dubas eventually on this team struggling under Sullivan. And Mike Sullivan's a great guy. I get that. Everybody at Fenway loves Mike Sullivan. Mike Sullivan wants to try and fix this. I totally understand that. But I think there's a real good example of something in the last week or so of an organization who does not sit around and wait for these things to get fixed by people who maybe aren't showing the flexibility necessary to fix it. Boston is now fired. Their last 3 coaches have all been Jack Adams winners, and they've all been fired. And they've all gone on to jobs elsewhere and found success, or maybe will find success elsewhere. And the Bruins have been willing to take those harsh and sometimes uncomfortable steps. Do you think Dubas is willing to do that? Or do you get the sense that he wants to give Mike Sullivan the opportunity to try and see this thing through?
I think it's a complicated issue, because if you're looking at the direction of this team, and I something that Kyle Dubas said at the beginning of the year kind of sticks with me. He kept reiterating in his press conference that the Penguins have the chance to change the story this year. And right now, they're not changing the story. No. They've missed the playoffs for the past 2 seasons. And I guess if you're looking at this from a more holistic perspective, if they don't compete this year, that might not be the worst thing. And, getting a new head coach might give them a jolt, put them up in the standings, but is it really going to put them in a spot to actually compete for the playoffs? I don't know. These unless a new coach can completely overhaul this defensive system and the system as a whole, I just don't see that happening. But I do also think there's a point that everything reaches where you just need a new voice in the room. And I can tell you from being in that room that they're dejected. I mean, these guys, they're frustrated. I just don't think there's a direction. I don't think this team has an identity. And at some point, something's got to give. So if you're Kyle Dubas, I mean, you're going to have to basically, it's going to come down to choosing between your coach and choosing between some longer tenured players here. And those are going to be some very difficult decisions. But I mean, I think if you look at what Boston's done, as you said, they fired a very good coach with a very good track record in the league. And Mike Sullivan is a very well-respected coach in all hockey circles. And I think it was Dan Kongursky told me this, a colleague. He said that Team USA uses like his videos for their training, for training coaches, for their developmental program. I mean, this guy's very well respected, and he's the 4 Nations and Olympic coach for a reason.
Yeah.
But, there's a point that it reaches where even good coaches, that messaging goes stale. And whatever message he's trying to send to this locker room at this point just isn't getting through.
So this is what's interesting to me, Kelsey, and I think it's a really good point you bring up. Like, it's being in Pittsburgh, both of us, it's the same thing you hear about Mike Tomlin all the time. Oh, they did fire Tomlin. Well, he'll get a job tomorrow somewhere else. Yes, absolutely, he would. It's similar to that in that, yes, Mike Sullivan would get a job tomorrow somewhere else. Somebody's going to hire him. He's not going to sit around and wait. But I don't know if in this case that necessarily means you shouldn't be willing to rip off that Band-Aid if you really think he's not getting through to these guys anymore. However, then the other side of that argument would be, well, the guys he's maybe not getting through to are the ones that aren't going to be a part of this in the future anyway, right? Like, you get the sense that Erik Karlsson is not necessarily, nobody's getting through to Erik Karlsson right now. The older guys, Letang maybe to an extent, I know they hear Mike Sullivan and they respect Mike Sullivan, but clearly it's not showing in the way that they're playing. So is there maybe something to the idea of, like you said, making that choice of, okay, well, if we're not going to get rid of Sullivan, maybe it's time to see what we can do to move on from some of these players. The problem there being, I don't know how you move on from Carlson in that contract. I don't know how I don't know how you convince Chris Letang, if he's really dead set on finishing his career here. No, you've got to waive your no move clause to send you somewhere where maybe you've got a chance to win in the last couple of years. So that's the issue here. Is I wouldn't have a problem keeping Mike Sullivan around to see things through to the other side if there were a way to move on from the players who I think are holding things back the most right now.
Yeah, and that's what's tricky about this, and I think, you have other guys like Rust, like Raquel. Obviously Pettersson's a UFA. I think he's probably going to be gone sooner rather than later. There's some defensive injuries around the league that are kind of driving up his value right now. So, it's, again, a complicated issue. I also don't really see any of the quote unquote big four guys from moving on. The Letangs, obviously the Crosbys, Malkin's not going anywhere, and Carlson. But, there needs to be some kind of message sent to this room. And trading a guy like Noel Chari, trading a guy like Alex Nedeljkovic probably isn't going to send that large message that you're looking for. So as a side note, I do think those are two guys that are probably pretty heavily on the trade block right now. You think about Yoel Blomqvist and the goaltending. I think Nedeljkovic is a really good trade candidate right now.
Yeah.
But, I think in order to really send a message to the room, it has to be a Raquel or a Rust or a Pettersson, because those are guys that have been here basically, what are we looking at for Raquel? 4 years. Pettersson's been here since 2018. So Russ has been here since the Cup years. So I think there's something that can be done about that. Russ and Raquel have partial no movement clauses. I think Russ is still full no movement clause right now. So again, it's going to be complicated just because of the contracts these guys have. But I think that a bigger move needs to be made sooner rather than later. And Pettersson's probably the easiest guy to trade right now.
You mentioned you're in the room, Kelsey. You're there just about every day. What do you get? I wasn't there for the Utah game, but I read a description of Sid having his picture taken in the locker room with that 600 puck, and just not even a smile on his face, like just this far away, distant, glazed look, the 1,000-yard stare, right? The most important piece to this, obviously, is Sidney Crosby. More important than Mike Sullivan, more important than Kyle Dubas, more important than even Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang. What is your sense of how he's processing this, and just how much, I think I've asked you this before, just how much patience he has for seeing this through to the other side? As much as Mike Sullivan wants to see it through to the other side, that's all well and good. We know coaches, even the best amongst them, get replaced all the time in the NHL. You don't replace Sidney Crosby. Sidney Crosby's in Pittsburgh as long as Sidney Crosby wants to be in Pittsburgh. But how much is this wearing on him? And would it maybe, I'm just trying to find a way to make him feel a little bit better about this, would it maybe serve them well to, again, I know he's buddies with Malkin and Letang, and maybe it's ridiculous to think that those two would be moved aside, but to move on from some of these veterans and breathe some new life into this thing and give Sid the role of mentor. Not officially a player coach, but that leadership on the ice with the young guys, and say, hey, these are your proteges now, Sid. Here's your chance to pass it on to the next generation. I'm just trying to think of ways to keep him emotionally invested in what is a sinking ship.
Yeah, and I think that's a tough thing. And just, for perspective too, after Friday's loss against Winnipeg, Sid didn't make himself available to the media, which is pretty rare.
Yeah.
After games, and you could tell late in that game that frustration was really seeping in for him. And obviously, the mood in the locker room, especially with Sid, after the loss against Utah was palpable. I mean, he's frustrated. You can tell the whole room is. I thought Nedeljkovic had some interesting things to say too. But in terms of keeping Sid engaged, it's tough because if you're Dubas, and I mean, I think it's pretty clear at this point that he's trying to rebuild on the fly. And the contracts, everything he did this past summer indicates that. And the way this team is tanking right now, that's, that seems to be the direction. But, I think there has to be some level of urgency on management's part to compete. Because the one thing Sid hates is losing.
Right.
This is driving Sid crazy. Anyone can see it. He hates losing. And FSG, we had that media availability with FSG at the beginning of the season. They said that they basically promised Sid a better roster this year, and promised improvement this year, and we're not seeing that. So
yeah,
I think first and foremost, I mean, to keep Sid emotionally invested, something's got to change. And there has to be some kind of initiative on the part of management to change the culture, because there's something just that's sour in that room right now. But I'm intrigued by the idea of Sid kind of becoming a player coach or mentor,
right.
as you said, because I think that's a way for him to kind of almost see the process happening firsthand, becoming a part of that process of turning things over to the next generation, turning things over to, like you said, the other side of that window, which, I mean, I think if you're Kyle Dubas and the Penguins, you're hoping that that's as early as next season that they can start turning this thing around. But, it's a complicated issue because Sid likes winning more than anything. And, you can make him a player coach, you can make him a mentor to these younger guys, but he wants to win. So there has to be some kind of urgency on management's part from that standpoint.
I've made this comparison before. I see so much similarity between Tom Brady at the end of his career and Sidney Crosby now in the waning years of his career. It's why I say all the time, I can see Sid playing for another 5-6 years, right? Like this contract is not necessarily a drop dead date for him in 2027 or whatever, whenever it comes to an end. It's so much harder. Brady had new life breathed into his career by moving on somewhere else and getting to play with new players in a lot of cases. It's so hard to change the team around the player rather than the player going to a new team. And that's what they're trying to accomplish here. I wonder if that idea of not only competing more, obviously, than they are this year, but the idea of gaining some legacy from it as well, if that has any appeal to Sid. Because like you said, winning is most important to him, but is there is there a desire to sort of leave that legacy? And when he's done, still look back on the Penguins and his time as an active player and say, oh, okay, what you see in Pickering there, what you see in McGroarty there, what you see in this guy there. I remember we had that conversation on the ice at practice one day, and I remember seeing that develop in him. I think maybe there's some value there with a guy like Sid who has such a great sense of history that maybe that appeals to him to be a part of history in the future, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And Sid loves the mentorship aspect of this. And you can see that in the way that he is with young players. And, even throughout training camp, you see him pull aside like some guys during practice and during camp, just giving them pointers. And, you talk to any younger guy in that room and they just glow about how Sid's leadership shines through and conversations they've had with him and a lot of the other veterans on the team too. I mean, I don't want to keep Sid exclusive here because that's the case with all these veterans. They like that mentorship role. They like helping these younger players. And even Owen Pickering has talked along the blue line. Marcus Pettersson has helped him a lot. So that's something these veterans do take pride in. I think that's why I think playing these younger guys and having some of these younger players on this roster might help the situation in the room a little bit, because it kind of provides this new energy, at least, and this new look, because these guys want to be here. These younger guys want to make an impression. These younger guys want to stick at the NHL level. And like I said, they bring that enthusiasm and that energy that you don't necessarily get out of, these veteran players that are just sick of losing. So I think that there's a balance that needs to be struck a little bit with that. And just having those younger guys around for Sid to mentor, I think would make a great deal of difference. And they're going to have some decisions to make. Cody Glass and Blake Lizotte are skating on their own. They're probably not too far from a return here. Valtteri Puussinen's been, scratched a lot. They have Poland in the lineup right now. They have Puljujärvi, but there's going to be some guys moving in and out. So for a guy like Pickering, for a guy like Poland, for even a guy like Puljujärvi, who's been a little bit of a journeyman, but is still only 26 years old, like, these guys value the advice and the mentorship of these veteran guys like Sid. And if you can bring some of these younger guys more into the picture, the guys like the Ponomarevs and the guys like the Broses and Koivunen, like, some of these guys that, could learn something from these guys if you trade off an Achari, if you trade off a Drew O'Connor. I think there's some value in that. Yes, I agree.
When we last talked a few weeks ago, Kelsey, we talked about this stretch of the schedule that they're in the midst of right now. And they're really only a few games deep into it. I would look at kind of like December 10th, that home game against Colorado is maybe, I don't want to say a drop dead date, but like, okay, if we haven't been able to turn it around by this point, then maybe it's time to pull the trigger on some of those big waves that you mentioned happening, because it does not get any easier. Vancouver visiting, then you've got Florida on the schedule. You got a trip to Boston in the middle of things there, as well as games against the Rangers and the Leafs. And I mentioned December 10th when the Avalanche are in town. Do you think I'll ask you sort of a double-barreled question here before I let you run. If it were you, would you have a date in mind for when the ship has got to get righted to some extent before you pull the trigger on those moves? The Petterssons, the Rakels, maybe even Rust, if you can get him to waive some teams off the no-trade list. And what do you think Kyle Dubas's date may be for any of those kind of moves, or what I know a lot of fans are dying for, a move on Mike Sullivan?
Yeah. I think as far as trades, I would even venture to say that date's kind of already passed. I think there is some urgency to make some moves now. And whether that's, the bigger guys, the Petterssons, even the Nedeljkovic's to a certain extent, I do think that might be given a little bit more runway. But I think December 10th is probably a pretty decent gauge date, as you said. I'd even maybe extend it to around Christmas time, around the 23rd against the Flyers, because they do have that 4-day break between the Flyers game and the Islanders game on the 28th. So, it's hard because, again, I think this year, if you look ahead to next season, you could argue that this year was supposed to be a bridge year. They have a lot of cap to work with. They're going to be selling off a lot of contracts. They'll have a lot of draft capital to work with next season. Yeah. So, in terms of the competitive window, I'm not entirely convinced that this season was supposed to be a part of that anyway. So if you're looking at getting the most out of some of these assets, Pettersson's not playing particularly well. Nedeljkovic isn't playing particularly well. I think those contracts are probably better to sell off sooner rather than later to get the most value you can out of them before the value tanks. And as I said, there are defensive injuries across the league that make Pettersson a little bit more valuable right now. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a Pettersson, a Nedeljkovic, somebody like that moved soon, as in the next couple weeks. But as far as some of those other ones, the Rusts, the Rakels, maybe even the buntings you could look at there. I see those, if they're going to happen during the season, that's probably more of a deadline move, I would think, because they're probably going to want to maximize the value that they can get, since those are longer term contracts. So, yeah, I kind of see any moves that they're going to make in the shorter term as being those selling off those UFAs, or just those easier to sell contracts, so to speak. I think any of those bigger ones are probably either going to be deadline or off-season moves if they make them.
Well, it's definitely not going to get any less interesting. We'll see where it goes from here. Like I said, the long and winding road has taken them somewhere deep into the forest, and I don't know how much farther I want to try and drag that analogy out, but it's not going well. And the one thing you can count on, great coverage at draftnation.com, and the hockey news from Kelsey Surmacz. So, Kelsey, thanks so much for going on the clock today with Draft Nation. We'll see where it goes from here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Chris.